Okay, about that time. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well this afternoon. Everybody's staying safe, and hope you aren't too bored. This is Psych 301 Research, Design, and Methodology. Okay, and wanted to mention a couple things before we started. First, Stats Quiz 3, we're all graded. Y'all did a great job. Lots and lots of perfect papers and lots of A's. So I hope most of you were happy with your Stats Quiz 3 grade. And that means the final is all we have left. All we have left is the final, and we'll talk more about the final next week. Now, one thing I did want to mention is there's extra credit for completing the teaching evaluation. I believe this past Saturday you were sent an email that had a link to do the teaching evaluation for Psych 301. And if you didn't get it, wait, be patient. They'll keep sending it. They're going to send it to your iowastate.edu email address. And once you have completed that, if you go to the quizzes section, go to the quizzes section and click the link. So there'll be a link in the quizzes section for getting extra credit for doing the teaching evaluation. It's worth 1 point of extra credit. So you just click on the link, and then you take the little quiz that says, did you do the teaching evaluation? You say yes and submit, and you'll get 1 point of extra credit for the class. Now, you only have until midnight on Thursday next week. Midnight on Thursday, that little quiz thing is going to disappear. So please get the extra credit before that, okay? All right, well, we've been talking about survey research, and one last thing I wanted to mention, and it's one of the most important things I wanted to mention, and that is the margin of error. I think if you ask people on the street, there's not 1 in 1,000 who could tell you what the margin of error means in survey research. Like, you've probably seen the results of a survey, and then you'll see, like, below it'll say a margin of error plus or minus 3% or plus or minus 4%, something like that. And so let's say I ask the average person, all right, what does that margin of error mean? What does it mean that it's plus or minus 3%? And they said, well, it's how much the poll could be wrong. And I say, how much it could be wrong? Wrong from what? And they said, well, wrong from what it really is. And then I ask them, well, what do you mean what it really is? And now they don't know. They're not sure. Let me tell you a story, and I bet there are other people that you've met who are kind of like my friend in this story. But when I was in college, there was a governor's race in Kansas, and I hadn't decided who I wanted to vote for yet. And the governor candidates were going to have a debate on TV. And so I wanted to watch the debate. And my friend who wanted me to go play basketball with him and not watch the debate. So I said I wanted to watch the debate. He brought in this survey that had been done that was reported in the newspaper. And what the survey found was that the Republican was in the survey, they gotten 46% of people said they were for the Republican. The Democrat, 38% of people were for the Democrat, and then undecided people were 16% in the survey. And then the survey reported a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. Margin of error plus or minus 3%. So let's take the Republican here. What's the worst case scenario for the Republican? Well, we take 46%. Margin of error is plus or minus 3%. So the worst case scenario for the Republican is 43%, right? If he's got 46%. So 43% for the Republican. Well, what's the best case scenario for the Democrat? Well, the Democrat has 38%, plus or minus 3%. So we're going to add 3% to give us the best case scenario for the Democrat. So the best case scenario for the Democrat would be 41%. So the worst case scenario for the Republicans, 43%. Best case for the Democrat is 41%. So my friend said the election is over. I mean, there's no way the Democrat can win. the survey says so, even in the best case scenario for the Democrat and the worst case scenario for the Republican still wins. All right, what my friend thought is that the margin of error on the survey was how the votes were going to come out during the election. He thought what it meant was the scientists had figured out, based on past elections, that this far out in the election, if the survey looks like this, well, then the votes are going to be plus or minus 3% of these totals. That is incorrect. And in fact, my friend should have known it was incorrect, because you aren't allowed to vote for undecided here, and so that 16% has to go somewhere. So no, it can't be that that's how the votes are going to come out, is plus or minus 3% of these numbers. Well, what does the margin of error mean? Well, let's begin by saying that you have to have done probability sampling in order to put a margin of error on your survey. If you go to like the CNN website and they're asking people, who do you think won last night's Democratic presidential debate, something, that's a convenience sample, right? And so it wouldn't make sense on a sample like that was done on the internet and just took anybody who came, there's no random selection, to put a margin of error on the results. So margin of error only makes sense, and its calculations depend on the fact that it was a probability sample. You did true random selection. Well, what the margin of error is, let's put it down formally, and this is one of the most important things in the class, and I want you to be able to educate people about. What does the margin of error mean in survey research? Okay, it means there is a 95% chance that if the survey were conducted on the entire population exactly as it was conducted on the sample, the results would be within the margin of error. Okay, what does the margin of error mean in survey research? It means there is a 95% chance that if the survey were conducted on the entire population, exactly as it was conducted on the sample, the results would be within the margin of error. So you may remember from stats class, I'm sure they talked about 95% confidence intervals. That's what this margin of error is. Now, a margin of error is a 95% confidence interval around these numbers. Now, when they get these numbers are done on a sample of people. In this case, the population that we wanted to generalize the results to, the population of people would be all voters in the state of Kansas. So what they did is they took a sample of about 5,000 people to get this survey that they took. And what they're saying is that, okay, if we took this survey we did on the 5,000 people that we randomly selected, and then we happened to ask everybody in the population, and we did the poll exactly as we did it on the sample. Well, if we did it on every voter in the state of Kansas, and we gave them our survey, then the results would be plus or minus 3% of these values. So it's not how the vote is going to come out. It's due to the fact that, of course, samples can be somewhat non-representative, and so it's a 95% confidence interval around these numbers. So why doesn't it predict how the votes are going to come out? Well, the reason it doesn't predict how the votes are going to come out is because the number of votes somebody gets in an election is a function of two things. One thing is how much support they have in the population, and that's what a survey will show you. But the other thing is how likely are those people to actually go vote on election day. And that explains those surveys that we got from the 2016 presidential election, if you recall, that were so far off. All these surveys claim to be plus or minus 4% at most, and many of them plus or minus 3%. But you can see, like Trump it's 6.6% more than he was predicted here, and 3.5% more here. So these were definitely outside the margin of error for a lot of these surveys. And the reason is this. It's that People, when they were called on the phone, they said, yeah, I'd vote for Hillary. But when it actually came to election day, they weren't as motivated as Trump voters, and they wouldn't go out and actually vote on election day. So nobody's lying. These people weren't lying about how the results of their survey came out. They are correct in how they came out. And it would be plus or minus 3% of the actual values here if they surveyed everybody in the population. But that's not how the votes are going to come out, because what the survey cannot capture is how likely people are to go vote. This has happened a number of times. Iowa caucuses are a good example of this. I don't know if you remember when in 2008, Barack Obama won Iowa, and it essentially made his political career when he won the Iowa caucuses. And before the Iowa caucuses that year in 2008, it was like Obama and Clinton. They were all like, neck and neck, and nobody knew who was going to win, Obama or Clinton, because the polls were showing them being really close. And then when the actual vote came, Obama was first, but Clinton was third. Actually, Jonathan Edwards finished second in the election. And the reason is that, well, Jonathan Edwards' support was, we say in politics, an inch wide and a mile deep. That is, he didn't have many people who supported him, but the people who did really believed in him and would go show up on caucus night. Hillary Clinton's support, we would say, was kind of a mile wide and an inch deep. She had a lot of people who supported her, but they didn't support her so much that they were actually willing to show up on election day. Well, the point of all this is, I bet you have friends who are going to, like my friend, who think that the survey they see in the paper is a prediction of how their election's going to come out. They might see their candidate that they like behind in the survey and then not go vote as a result of that. Well, this is something I want you to educate people about, and you're one of the 1 in 1,000 people in our culture who now understands what the margin of error in survey research actually means. And so the right thing to tell somebody who's not going to vote because they can see their candidate behind in a survey is, well, wait a second now. If you're behind in the survey, the only chance you have of winning is if you get a higher turnout than the other candidate, which frequently happens. And so that's definitely when you want to vote, is when you see your candidate behind, because now that's the only chance you have to get a higher turnout. Okay, well, that's what I wanted to say about margin of error. Now I'm going to end the survey research with an example that I always use here. And I don't know how, if you can see this or not. Maybe I can blow it up a little bit. All right, this is as much as I can blow it up, I think. Okay, well, I'm going to read this to you because it might be small. Now, this was a survey done by a sociology class here at Iowa State for the 2008 Iowa caucuses. So, as you can imagine, a lot of media outlets are interested in how college students are going to vote in all the Iowa caucuses. And then in 2008, there were several candidates who were trying to appeal to college students in particular. So the sociology class did this survey of Iowa State students for the 2008 caucuses. And this survey appeared everywhere. My goodness, it was on Fox News, it was on Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post had it, CNN had it, I think several other news outlets, because they sent it out as a press release after they'd done the survey. And so I'm going to read to you, because I think it might be too small, how they actually did their survey, and we'll see what you think about this. Okay? The sample of 2,185 students, which represented 8% of 26,160 enrolled students, with a margin of error of plus or minus 1%. Oh my goodness. At the 95% confidence interval, at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, was drawn between November 14, 2007 and November 19, 2007. Starting at noon on November 14th, all enrolled students were sent an email message containing a link to the survey site, which was open until noon on November 19, 2007. Now, this is a very interesting survey. First thing I want to ask you about this survey is, What sort of sampling of the 5 sampling techniques we talked about, what sort of sampling are they using in this survey? Do they do some form of probability sampling where they randomly selected people from the population? No, they didn't do that. Did they do quota sampling where they selected a group of people specifically so they would match the demographic characteristics of the broader population? No, they didn't do that. So if they didn't do probability sampling and they didn't do quota sampling, what's left? Well, what's left is convenience sampling, and that's exactly what this is. This is a convenience sample. Now, they're claiming plus or minus 1% accuracy on this convenience sample. And you might see a problem right here, and that is you're not allowed to put a margin of error on a convenience sample. You did not meet the requirement for computing the margin of error, which is that you did random selection. So it doesn't make sense to put this margin of error on this survey. Further, 1%, I've never seen a margin of error that small before. They're claiming this is a really accurate survey. Well, it was a convenience sample, and remember, 50% is pretty much the bottom that is considered an acceptable return rate. What return rate did we get on this survey? Well, you can see they got an 8% return rate. They sent the email out to everybody, the entire population, 26,160, and then they got 2,185 reporting back. So this is a convenience sample with an 8% return rate, and somehow it's the most accurate survey in the history of the world. So I didn't know what was going on here. I wrote to the teacher, the professor who taught the sociology class that did this. And I said to him, gosh, it looked to me like this survey was a convenience sample. And I mean, isn't it wrong to put a margin of error on a convenience sample? How did you compute the margin of error? That's what I asked him. So I waited a day, and he didn't write back. I waited another day, and he didn't write back. Now I waited another day, and he didn't write back. And then I waited another day, and he did write back. What he said is that the students and he had initially released the survey without the margin of error, and they released it with a press release to all these news outlets, and then the news outlets started calling him and wanted to know what is the margin of error on your survey. Well, he knew he couldn't do the real margin of error calculations because he hadn't done a random sample. So what he did was he took this group, this is the population size, 26,160, and then pretended like the 2,185 people who sent back the survey were a random sample of this population. And so, yes, if these really were randomly selected students from a population of this size, well, the plus or minus 1% would be right. Now, I told you that it was expensive to do probability sampling. Well, they found a nice way around that. You just do convenience sampling, and then when you're done, you act like it's probability sampling. So, I'll allow you to decide what the ethics are of what they decided to do here. He said he was under a lot of pressure to give the margin of error because, of course, all the students in his class wanted the survey to be on, these big news outlets. I think it was an awful thing to do here, but I'll leave that up to you. And I'm hoping that, having listened to the survey lectures, if you had read about this, you would know what a horrible, horrible survey it was and would be able to educate other people about that. So, that's what I wanted to tell you about. More than any other topic that we're going to talk about in here, I think the margin of error is something people think they know about but really don't, and it causes a lot of problems, and you need to educate your fellow citizens about this. All right, well, now let's get on to the main topic of the day. So we're pretty much done with talking about the actual methods for collecting data at this point. And now what we're going to talk about today and a little bit next time is writing up research, how the publication process actually works. Okay, well, what we're going to talk about on this, I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you right up front. This is probably my least favorite topic in the class. It is an important topic because you are going to be expected to know this for the Psych GRE, for example. And so, yeah, I think we do need to discuss it, but I'm going to try and go fairly quickly over it and give you the stuff you need because it is kind of dull. I'll also try to give you some insights to make it more interesting into how the actual publication process works in psychology and how it's different maybe from other fields. I didn't know any of that before I actually started publishing papers in psychology. So what we're going to be talking about is we're going to talk about APA style. APA is the American Psychological Association. And they publish this book. It's in its 7th edition. It's the publication manual of the American Psychological Association. If you go to graduate school, you will almost certainly want to purchase this book. What this book is a set of rules that you must follow if you want to publish your article in an APA journal. So, the most impressive journals, the biggest journals in psychology are published by the APA, the American Psychological Association. And I'm sure you've read some of these journals. So, Psychological Bulletin, Psychological Review, Journal of Experimentals, there are several journals of experimental psychology, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Journal of Counseling Psychology. These are all APA journals, and so they are the most impressive journals in our field. So this is a set of rules about how you have to prepare your manuscript if you want to publish in those journals. And it contains all kinds of rules, like how big your margins have to be, what kind of font you have to use, how you should abbreviate things, how you should format things. And then it tells you like the different sections of your manuscript and what's included in each section. Now, if the world were full of cool and reasonable people like us, there'd be no need for all these silly rules. Nobody really thinks that whether your top margin on your manuscript is 1 inch or 1 1/4 inches, it has any impact whatsoever on the scientific enterprise. Unfortunately, there are lots of crazy people out there who really do care about these silly rules, and so that's why we all have to follow them. I'm going to tell you my horror story now. You probably won't be able to sleep at night after this story. But one time I was going to publish an article in this journal, Perception. Perception's an English journal. And like most journals, it pretty much follows APA style, and you're still supposed to format your manuscript that way, even if it's not an APA journal. And so I formatted my manuscript in APA style. And this was in the old days when you couldn't send it electronically. You had to actually send physical copies. And they wanted 10 physical copies sent to England. So I put a big box of manuscripts and sent it all the way to England. Okay, well, like 2.5 weeks later, the whole box comes back to me. And the guy had not even sent out my article for review. He sent me a letter. What I had done is, in this journal, they wanted you to follow APA style, with one exception. In APA style, when you're referencing an article, you put the author's name first, you put the year of publication next, and then the title of the article. Well, they wanted the title of the article first, and then the author's name, and then the year. That's how they wanted it formatted in their journal, and I'd done it in standard APA format. So I get these box of manuscripts from England. There's a letter from the editor who says, Dear Dr. Cooper, for whatever reason, you appear to be unaware of the proper method of formatting references for our journal. Should you wish to bring your manuscript in line with our editorial standards, we would be happy to consider your submission. What a jerk. This guy made me change that one little thing and print out 12 more copies and send it all the way back to him in England just for that, when it would have been the easiest thing in the world is when if he sent it out for review, to say in his letter when I got it back, oh yeah, one of the things you need to do when you revise this is you need to revise your references. But he decided to be a jerk about things. So that's why we have to know this. Now, I'm not going to concentrate on the silly rules like the margins and what your abbreviations you should use. But the thing you have to know when you're taking like the Psych GRE is you're going to need to know the names of the sections of a manuscript, and you're going to need to know what is found in those sections. And so that's what we're going to concentrate on today, is learning the sections of the manuscript and the things you would find. How the questions are going to be on the test is I'm going to give you like a description of a particular section or some information you'd find in the section. You have to tell me the name of the section of the manuscript where you'd find that. Okay. So I should also mention APA style is used not just in psychology, but pretty much in all the social sciences. So even if you are not a psychology major, most of the social sciences still use APA style, so this will still be of value to you. So the title then of this section is the sections of the manuscript. And let me distinguish the manuscript from the article. The manuscript is what you write up on your computer, on your word processor, and print off. And then, so that's the manuscript. The article is then the publisher is going to put the text into columns, and then they're going to incorporate the figures and the tables into it. And so the thing that actually appears in the journal, that's the article. But what you, the researchers, send to the journal, that's the manuscript. Okay, and as we go through, I want to tell you about some things about publishing that maybe you don't know about publishing in psychology. But the first section of the manuscript is the title page. It's always page 1 of the manuscript. It includes the following. The title, which is supposed to be 15 words or fewer, and ideally people would know what the independent and dependent variables are by reading your title. And then it also includes the author's, I'm going to say author's names, and then it includes the author's affiliations. Essentially, who was supporting the authors financially when they did the research. All right, let me talk about authorship in psychology, because this is one thing students are confused about, and it's one thing in which psychology differs from other fields. So, if you've read psychology articles and journals, you'll find that almost all of them are not just by one person, they're by several people. And you might have wondered, well, what's the deal? Did they each write different parts of the manuscript, or what? Okay, well, being an author on a scientific article in psychology does not necessarily mean you actually wrote anything on the paper. What it takes to be an author on a scientific paper is that in psychology you had a substantial scientific contribution to the project. And so let me explain what I mean by that. So let's say I have an idea for doing some research. I would call my graduate students up to my office and I'd tell them the research I want to do. Then they would go down to the lab, they would collect the stimuli, they would program the computer to do the experiment I wanted them to do. We'd have undergraduate research assistants run the subjects through the experiment. Then my graduate students are going to analyze the data, and then they're going to bring it up to me. Then I'm going to write up the article and send it in. Now, when we send in the article, I will be first author on the article. So it's a big deal to be the first author. The first author is the one with primary scientific responsibility for the article. That means they are the one who came up with the original idea, and then they are the one who wrote up the article. Some of the other authors might have written little sections of it, but in the main, it's going to be the first author that writes the article. Now, my graduate students also are going to be authors on that article, even if they didn't write any of it. And that's because their contributions to the paper were substantial scientific contributions that require specific training. So, programming the computer to show the stimuli and then analyzing the data afterwards, those are considered substantial scientific contributions to the project. And so my graduate students would also be authors on the paper. And they're supposed to be in the order of their contribution, how much work they did. And so as you go down the list of authors, each person did less work. Ideally, as you can imagine, there's a lot of fighting that goes on among people about where their authorship could be, and almost everybody has cases where they're angry about where they were put as authors on an article. But that's neither here nor there. Now, you may not think this is fair, but the undergraduate assistants who actually ran the subjects through the experiment, they do not get to be authors on an article, because running the subjects through the experiment is not considered to be a substantial scientific contribution. There is a section where you thank the people who helped you, the acknowledgement section with the article, and I always put the names of our undergraduate research assistants in that section, but they are not authors on the article. Now, that's not the way it is in other fields. In business, for example, when there are multiple authors on an article, they're just listed in alphabetical order, so you have no idea who actually came up with the idea. And then in medicine, anybody who had anything at all to do with the research, like somebody like an anesthesiologist who put the patient out, might not even understand that there was research going on, gets to be an author on the paper. So medical research often will have 15, 20 authors on a paper, is not uncommon, because pretty much you don't have to do very much to become an author on a medical journal. So lots of differences between different fields. That's how your field works. Now, I wanted to say one more thing, because I know a lot of you have been applying to graduate school or thinking about applying to graduate school. And on those applications, it asks you often to list your publications. And I'll get students coming to my office very, very worried because they don't have any publications and they think they won't get into graduate school. Well, don't worry if you don't have any publications. I've seen lots and lots of graduate applications. I would say less than 2% have any publications when they apply. That would be rare for an undergraduate to have a publication. Having said that, if you get the opportunity to get a publication sometime in your undergraduate career, it's definitely worth doing. It's going to be worth buku brownie points on your application if you actually have been an author on an article. Now, author on an article might be hard, given that you're about not too far from graduating, most of you. But if you can work in a lab and be an author on like a poster presentation or a conference presentation, that's impressive too, and would be more common. So I definitely encourage you, if you've got the opportunity and you're applying to graduate school, it's a good thing to have a publication or a conference presentation authorship. But it's not necessary. It's not necessary. So go ahead and apply even if you don't have that. Now, the author's affiliations. Each author on the article, they will give the place that was paying your salary when you did the research. So my affiliation is usually Iowa State University, but occasionally I'll go to Virginia. I work at the Night Vision Lab at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. Sometimes, and when I work with them, then my affiliation is Night Vision Laboratory at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. All right, so that's the title page. It's always on page 1. Second section of the manuscript is the abstract. The abstract. The abstract is a short summary of the article that always begins on page 2. Abstract's a short summary of the article, always begins on page 2 of the manuscript. Okay, the abstract is probably the most important section of your paper, because it's the only section that most people are going to read. So here's why we have an abstract in psychology and in science generally. Let's say somebody's doing research on a topic, so they're looking at titles of articles, and they see a title of an article that they think might be interesting, might be what they're looking for. And so in these search engines, they have the abstract usually, and you can read the abstract right there online, and then you can see, oh yeah, this is the sort of article I'm looking for, or maybe you'll see, no, it's not the sort of article I'm looking for. And so that's why it's so important. That's the only part of your article most people are going to read, is the abstract, just to see if it's worthwhile to read more of it. So they're real strict these days. It has to be less than 150 words because they usually do put it on the search engine type things, and there's limited memory there, and so they really want to limit you to 150 words. But it should tell a bunch of stuff. An abstract should tell the following. A, the problem under investigation. B, the subjects. C, the research method, how you actually collected the data. D, the findings of the research. And then E, your conclusions, that is, what do you conclude about the theory that was being tested at the end. So that's a lot to do. Essentially, it summarizes every part of the article in 150 words, and so that's a very difficult thing to do. But that is what the abstract is. Okay. Section 3, third section of the manuscript is the introduction. Introduction always begins on page 3 of the manuscript. Now, the purpose of the introduction is to set up the research so people understand why you did it. The introduction includes introduction of the problem under investigation. That is, what is the phenomenon that you are studying in this paper? B, develop, I'm going to say, review the previous literature. I'll put in parentheses, literature review. This is called the literature review. All right, and this is the longest section of the manuscript and the one most people dislike writing the most. So you're going to have to set up why you did the research that you did in this article, and that's going to require you to look at other people's research who've also looked at this topic. And so you got to summarize the previous research on the topic so that people can understand why you're doing the study that you're doing now. So that's why the introduction is probably the longest section of the article, because the literature review can go on for quite a while. So one of the questions I like to ask on the final is, in which section of the manuscript would you find the literature review? And that would be in the introduction. Then C, you want to state the purpose and rationale of the present research. State the purpose and rationale of the present research. So presumably there has been some problem with the previous research, that maybe a hole in the research, or people didn't do the research right or something, but there's something that motivated you to do the research you're doing now, and presumably you're testing some sort of theory. And so now you're going to say, well, here's why we're doing the research that we're doing, and here's how the data should look if one theory is right, and here's how the data should look if the other theory is right. So that's the end of the introduction. You've told people what the purpose is of the research you're reporting in the article. Okay. Section 4. I am so sorry. Oh my goodness, how can I be so dumb? I thought I put my window at the bottom, so we're going to go back up. I am so sorry. All right, the introduction always begins on page 3 of the manuscript. The introduction includes A, introduction to the problem under investigation. B, review the previous literature, the literature review. And C, state the purpose and rationale of the present research. Not present researcher. Goodness. All right, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I did that. Okay, I hope you got your notes now. Pause it if you need to go back and see. All right, so fourth section is method, and it's not stop it. It's method. It's not methods. It's just method. And this is a recipe for conducting the reported research. That's how you should think about it. Now, it's not written like a recipe. A recipe is written in second person, where it's a series of directions. So, recipe might say, add 2 cups of flour to a bowl, add 3 cups of milk, something like that. So, it's giving you directions on how to do it. That's not how you write the method section in a scientific paper. How you'd write the method section in the scientific paper is, we showed the stimuli in the experiment on an Apple high-resolution monitor with 2,800 pixels of vertical resolution and 1,200 pixels of horizontal resolution. I don't think there's any monitor that's actually like that, but whatever. You get the thing. What you do is you say what you did when you did the research, but the reason why I call it a recipe is that you're supposed to be telling people all the stuff they need to know if they wanted to replicate your results. So that's why it's a recipe, is that what you're trying to convey to people is, here are the steps we took to get this data. The implication being, if you take these same steps, you're going to get similar data if you were to do this. Okay. So the method section, the method is divided into 3 subsections, typically 3 subsections. Subsections are A, the participants. It reports the number of subjects and the compensation they received. Participants reports the number of subjects and the compensation they received. Now, the participant section is very, very short if you're just using college students as subjects. So typically, one of my participant subsections would be participants in the research were Iowa State University undergraduate students who were enrolled in the introductory psychology class at Iowa State University. They received course credit for their participation. So just 2 sentences and I'm out. Now, if you're working with, say, brain damage subjects, and I do that sometimes, you'll often have to include like pictures showing their brain damage and large sections describing the sort of damage that they've had. If you're using schizophrenic patients or some sort of mentally ill population, then you're going to have to describe how you determined what mental illness they had. And then, of course, if you're using animals, you're going to have to describe what animals you were using. So it can get a little complicated, the participants section, if you're using a special population group, but usually it's pretty short. All right, B, next section is called the apparatus section, or apparatus, we'll say apparatus, and that describes how each piece of equipment was used. Okay. So here you're going to say, when I did chemistry reports when I was in college and high school, they would have an apparatus section, and you would just list all the stuff you used in the experiment, and that's all it was. It wasn't complete sentences. It was just a list of things like 2.5 grams of calcium carbonate, 300 milliliter beaker, 3 test tubes. That's what it was like. Well, this isn't quite like that. You use complete sentences and you describe what you did, but you describe what you did such that somebody else could, again, do the same thing if they wanted to. So I would say, for example, subjects were run through the experiment on an iMac computer with a monitor that had a vertical resolution of X and a horizontal resolution of Y. And then I might list the model of the timing board that I had. Anything that somebody would need to know to replicate the research, and any piece of equipment they would need, you describe how you used that equipment in the apparatus section. And then the bulk of the method section is the procedure section. And the procedure section does a number of things. It describes design aspects, like what was the IV, what IV levels were used, what was the DV, etc. Okay. It also describes the subject's task. It also describes the subject's task. That is, what did the subject actually have to do during the course of the experiment? How many trials did they do? Were there practice trials before they actually did the experiment? All of those things. How long did the experiment take? What were the instructions that the subject was given? You need all those things. Procedures used to dampen nuisance variables. So if you tried to keep some variables constant in order to lower the variance of your data, like maybe you tested everybody at the same time of day, or you restricted your subjects to a particular age range, something like that, you would mention that in the procedure section. And anything else necessary to replicate the research. So if there's anything else that people need to know, if they wanted to replicate your research, you put that in the procedure section. Okay, so the method section is the only one that's divided into subsections. That's divided into participants, apparatus, and procedure. All right, fifth section of the manuscript is the results, section. And the results reports the data collected in the research. This includes graphs or tables showing the data, and reports the results of the statistical tests used, including obtained test statistic values, degrees of freedom, and p-values. Okay, report the results of the statistical test used, including the obtained test statistics. So like if you're doing a t-test, you report t obtained. If you're doing an ANOVA, you report f obtained. And then you report the degrees of freedom and the p-values. So like you remember when we're doing the statistical tests, I always say formally, if we were writing this up for publication, we'd say t with 16 degrees of freedom was equal to 16.34. That's right. That's exactly how you would write it in the results section. Okay, well, a lot of students, after they get through Psych 301, I've had them tell me and say, you know, when I got to the results section of articles, it was all mumbo-jumbo to me. I didn't understand any of it, and now I understand it, and that makes me happy. We can say that's mostly what our class is about. It's getting you to be able to understand the results section of these articles, which is the one part that the average person doesn't understand. And so now you've been trained in research methods, you ought to be able to understand those. Now, you aren't going to report all the data in the results section. What you're going to do is you would average the data across the subjects to get the means of your dependent variable for each level of the independent variable, and then you'd probably have a graph or a table that would show that. One of the things I love to ask on the final is, in what section of a manuscript would you find out what statistical tests were done on the data? And I'm going to get a lot of people say the method section, but no, the method section is a description of how you collected the data. The results section is what you did after you collected the data, and that includes the statistical tests. So you don't need to do the statistical test to collect the data. That's why it does not belong in the method section. The first time you talk about the statistical analysis you do is in the results section. Now, results section is usually going to be pretty short because you're just going to show them a graph and then describe the statistical tests you've done on the data. One of the things that I wanted to point out, so important point, the purpose of the results section is to report the data, not to discuss the theoretical implications of the data. Okay, So this is the problem when everybody does their first article. You're all excited because, you said in the introduction, if the data look this way, theory A is right. If the data look this way, well, not right, but the data look this way, they support theory A. If the data look this other way, they support theory B. And now you've just reported the results, and so you want to say, so theory A, it made the right prediction. That's what you want to say, but you're not allowed to. You're supposed to not discuss the theoretical implications of the data in the results section. You're supposed to wait for the next section to do that. And let me explain why I think this is actually a good rule. When I get a manuscript to review, I don't immediately start reviewing the manuscript from the beginning. What I do is I'll start with the method section. I'll read that, and then I'll read the results section. That's the first thing I do. And so what I just want to read is what the people did and what they found. And then what I try to do is come up with my own explanation for why they got the results that they did. Then I go back and read the rest of the article and see if their explanation is the same as mine. If we both have the same explanation, then I'll probably encourage them to publish the article. But if I came up with a different explanation, then I'll say, well, no, the authors need to consider this alternative explanation. So it's important that the stuff in the method section and the results section be completely independent of the theories that you're testing, because this allows another person to read what you did, that's the method section, and what you found, that's the results section, without being influenced by the author's interpretation of what those things mean. And so you can come up with your own objective interpretation before you actually read the author's interpretation, and you can do that independently without being biased by the authors, as long as you keep theoretical discussion out of the method and results. All right, I've gone over actually my 50 minutes, so I guess I better stop. On Monday, we will finish off writing up research. Bye-bye, and everybody have a good weekend.